Hello, everyone. Welcome to Accessibility Talks. Accessibility Talks is a monthly virtual meetup where we come together to discuss topics around all things website accessibility. Traditionally, each month, a speaker will present an in-depth accessibility topic to the group, after which there'll be time to ask questions and discuss. I'm your host, Carrie Fisher, and this month we are shaking things up. The format a bit, we're going to have not one, not two, not three, but four accessibility experts joining us. And unlike past meetups where there's only one person giving a presentation, this month we're trying out this free-form panel discussion with questions from you, the audience. So I have a few questions lined up already for our panel, but if you have additional questions for our speakers today, please post them in the chat window or tag them on Twitter with the hashtag A11yTalks, spelled A11yTalks. But before we get to the questions, let's do some quick introductions. First up, in alphabetical order, we have Eric Bailey. He is a UX designer at Katina, if I said that right, in the greater Boston area. He prides himself on creating straightforward solutions that address a person's practical, physical, cognitive, and emotional needs using accessible, performant, device-agnostic technology, which roughly translates into he makes accessible websites. So when he's not using big words, Eric is watching Batman movies, drinking wine, and listening to Devo. Next up is the lovely Helena Mccabe. She is a senior front-end developer at Lullabot and lives in Orlando, Florida. She's passionate about creating online experiences that are both accessible to everyone. She's also one half of the Accessibots team on Twitter that promotes website accessibility. When she isn't teaching people how to say her name correctly, she can be found scuba diving in various tropical locales, including a recent dive inside a gigantic fish tank at a restaurant at Epcot. Disney. It's pretty awesome. And also my personal life goal now. Thirdly, we have Scott O'Hara. Scott O is an accessibility engineer at the Paciello Group and is also from the Boston area. When he's not at work, you can find him adding code to various accessibility-focused GitHub repos, including many of his own. That's where I originally found him lurking. In his spare time, Scott collects GoBot figurines and draws ice princesses on pumpkins. I know you all love me. So last but not least is Scott Vinkle. Scott V is a front-end developer as well and a website accessibility advocate at Shopify. He's from the great city of Kingston, Ontario, and a big part of the Ally project, as well as many other accessibility organizations. Since Scott is from Canada, by default, he's extremely polite and may or may not have taught the singer Drake all his dance moves. So welcome, everybody. If I got anything wrong in your intros, let me know. We have links to all your Twitter profiles, but additional links we'll post on Twitter and also on the YouTube website. So just a reminder to our panelists that in order to get through as many questions as possible today, let's keep the answers as short as possible. I think we've already kind of talked about this a little bit offline, but a lot of these questions really could take up an entire hour on their own. So don't feel like you need to elaborate too much. But that being said, if you guys are ready, we'll jump into the first question. So the first question for each of you is, when did you first start working in website accessibility and why? And Helena, you want to kick us off?
Sure. For me, I'd always been really interested in disability advocacy and rights for a long time. And then I went to Front End Conf in 2013, and there was this guy who gave a talk about how his mom is blind and how accessibility impacts her. And I really wish I remembered his name. And if you're by any chance out here, please say hi, because I would love to thank you personally. But it was a really big turning point for me when I realized that I could combine my two passions, disability community support and web development. So I decided then and there to make it my specialty.
That's cool. And feel free, anyone to jump in. Scott? One of the Scotts? See, I'll just say Scott. One of you guys could just start talking.
Yeah, that's going to be rough. Okay, I'll go next.
Scott B. We'll be like kindergarten.
So the way I got into it was I sort of knew, I guess, what a screen reader was per se, but I never tried it before. So I don't know why, but one day I went out and I found one. And probably like most developers, the first one they try out is Chromebox. And so I enabled it on this website that I was currently working on. And it started speaking back to me like all the code, all the content that I was working on that day on that site. And it really sort of blew my mind to realize that, this is a way that folks out there really depend on experiencing the web. And just from there, I sort of came to a realization that, all the stuff that I put up previously in my career probably didn't work very well. So that really sort of was a huge concern. So from that point, I dove in feet first and had to learn everything that I could just to make sure, you want to make things performant, you want to make things responsive, and you also want to make things really accessible for everyone, right? So that's sort of where I got started there.
It's cool. Eric, do you want to tell us your story?
Sure. So I had a job working for a nonprofit that worked or subcontracted to the federal government, which required all of its documents to be basically 508 compliant. And I grew up, my mom was a occupational therapist. And so I was interested in design. And then I was like, oh, you mean there are rules that guarantee that design is good? That was my kind of aha moment where it all kind of clicked together. And so very, very thankful for that job, for putting me on this path.
Yeah, and last but not least, Scott O'Hara.
What was the question? No, yeah, I just kind of got into doing web accessibility just because, it just seemed like the right thing to do. I don't have any grander story than that, as much as I just broke my pen. I was just made aware that that accessibility was a thing and that HTML had semantics, and that was important for people to be able to appropriately use websites and web applications. And I was just like, that's kind of important. Seems like an important part of my job. So I just started focusing on that, and the more I focused on it, the more I was just like, oh, this is really kind of all I want to do. So now that's all I do.
Same.
Yeah, it seems like that sometimes, like a snowball effect. You have maybe either a personal thing, a person or like Eric's case, his mom worked in occupational therapy, or, we all have these little connections, but it all kind of comes down to that light bulb moment where you're like, oh yeah, I can do code and I can also help people, why not? So that's cool that we all kind of come from different backgrounds, but kind of arrived at the same point in similar fashions. Cool. Well, now we have to jump into the question from Cora LaJoy. Hopefully I said her last name right. Yell at me if I didn't. But what did her question was, what do you find to be the most common accessibility mistakes? I think that maybe talking from either a dev point of view or from clients, whatever perspective you want to jump in from, or both.
I mean, really, I don't think the most common accessibility mistake is a technical one. It's not planning for accessibility. I mean, without going into a project with time budgeted to do it and checkpoints in place, it won't happen, even if your team's completely mastered the technical skills.
Yeah, I mean, from a design perspective, obviously bad markup is bad markup, but it's one of those, so often you paint yourself into a corner. And so you get things like bad contrast and all these, bad icons and all these no-nos, but unless you're thinking in that mindset, yeah, you totally nailed it. It's just open season for bad things to kind of slip in.
I'd say I've seen in the past that folks who are aware of accessibility, the concepts and ARIA and all that, they try to go in and implement some of these things, and it ends up doing more harm than good in the end, which is kind of awful to say, but it is the truth. And I don't know, it's a tough call to try and, your heart's in the right place, but at the same time, it's this doesn't really make it better. So yeah, that's a thing.
So good intentions, but not pre-planning or having the budget or the time set aside to.
Not necessarily even budget, just the know-how, I suppose. Just being, aware of how to use these attributes and how people and assistive technologies interpret these attributes. So that's something I hope to alleviate with some teaching going forward in my career.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's sort of interesting. I know, Scott, we've kind of talked about this, Scott O, where you can kind of, so like, it's not a binary thing. So like, you're never going to have 100% perfect accessibility. And so like kind of coming into this, you know, I've definitely made these mistakes, and like making sure that you kind of facilitate an environment where, you know, back to your point of education up front, like it's okay to try it out as long as you actually test it and figure out if you're just.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. If you're going to do this, definitely test with assistive technology. That's for sure. At least then you'll figure it out. Oh, this actually doesn't make too much sense. So maybe I'll try something else, or maybe I'll ask someone else on the internet. It's a good idea too.
Yeah, there's people on the internet.
Yeah.
Few of us.
Where am I? What is going on here?
So it sounds like what you're saying is education is like a big part of what you think is as part of the accessibility mistakes. But I think Helena's point earlier was also like, if you have all that knowledge, let's say you have experts on your team, it's not going to happen unless you actually plan for it. It's kind of a holistic issue, right? There's not one right answer.
Yeah, I think expanding on all of that, one of the most common accessibility mistakes I've seen is a misinterpretation of specifications or expected behavior. Thinking that one understands exactly what it must, like what a user experience must be like for someone with a disability, whether it be, or a different cognitive style, and how they interpret UI. To think that, oh, hey, I ARIA'd this up, and now my divs are buttons and everything's A-okay. It's just like, yeah, that's cool. You did that, but did you really take into account all of the other kind of unseen ramifications of employing the pattern that you did? Because you think that you can tab through a website and you can access, air quotes there, for all the elements on a page, that somehow makes it accessible. That doesn't necessarily mean that just because you can tab to something doesn't necessarily mean that's the expected behavior of it. Yeah. So
I thought you were going to say something way more controversial, but I wonder too, because I'm waiting for it. Sometime it's going to happen. But one way to get around that, do you think, is having the ability for people who are actually using your site to have a way to contact the web maintainers, like having a contact form or an accessibility statement? Do you think that those kind of steps would help alleviate some of those issues? Or do you think that's more of a pre-planning design phase issue that you're more focused on? If that makes sense.
If you don't mind me hopping in, kind of two thoughts. First, this is a little bit on the accessibility mistakes thing, and it's kind of a misconception thing where not all disability types and conditions mean you're operating under a screen reader. And so like, that's kind of one thing I've run into definitely, which is like, well, it works as a screen reader, so it's fine. And like, no, there's all these other things you need to consider, and this is just one narrow path. And so kind of tying that into the accessibility statement, like pragmatically, I like that you can call up a human and explain your situation, and ideally they're empowered, the person on the end is empowered to help you over a normal kind of, somebody manning the help desk. But it starts to kind of brush into that creating a separate experience for an individual no kind of thing. And that's why I get squirrely around those kinds of questions.
Well, and this is just a panel discussion. Like, it's your opinion. It's also your experience as an accessibility expert in your field. Also, I know we're coming at it, a lot of us as UX designers and developers and front-end developers. And so our perspective might be different than maybe someone who's a client or person with a disability or, anything in between. So there's no right or wrong answers. It's just what you've experienced, what you think. Okay, there might be some wrong answers, but we won't penalize you because, again, like its accessibility is just like any field, technical field that's out there. It's ever changing, it's ever growing, it's fast. There's a lot going on. You can't be expected to know everything, but attempting to try to know a small piece is a good first step, at least.
I guess to rephrase it, I'm afraid of a situation where a subset of people have to contact a special person to operate the website in a special case.
No, that's true. I agree with you there. But if there is a way, if we've missed something or something like that, and users can reach out, I think it's really important to listen to your users. I mean, if someone reaches out and asks you to fix something, acknowledge them, respect the time that it took them to reach out to try to help you improve your product. That's a really nice compliment on their part, even if it feels like a criticism at the time. Then prioritize actually doing it for them if it's possible, and if it's not, explain that. Don't just blow them off and leave them hanging. It's important to respect our users.
Totally.
This might be a good time. If you see me looking around, it's because I'm checking Twitter and Slack, making sure those questions get answered and things pop up. But you got one that just came in that Mark posted in the chat from Twitter. And it's kind of a good segue from what we were just talking about, what are some good examples of types of disabilities that maybe have these unique accessibility problems and how they're best addressed. So we already talked about having some sort of accessibility statement, having a form for maybe contacting. But are there other ways that you think this could be addressed? And there's a bonus question of, are any of these just really covered by the WCAG 2.0? So I guess what that maybe is saying is if you've covered 2.0, level A, level AA, are you already, getting yourself in the right direction? Maybe you don't need to do additional issues or...
Yeah, to that point, I think it's also important to note that WCAG 2.1 is coming out, and I know that 2.0 really doesn't cover a whole heck of a lot of newer technology like mobile contacts and stuff like that. So if you're going and trying to match or get to the point where you are compliant with WCAG 2.0 AA, that's really a great start. I think that covers a whole lot of different disabilities that folks out there might have. But again, WCAG 2.1, it's pretty new. It's on the horizon, so also watch out for that for a lot of other contexts. But unique accessibility problems and how they are best addressed. Yeah, I don't know, I'm just thinking about this question.
So maybe talking about maybe other things besides what you think of, like, again, in my line of work with accessibility, like when you say that word, people automatically think of screen readers or they think of, extreme disabilities. Maybe talk about the other kinds of disabilities that there are out there, please.
Yeah, because humans aren't that formulaic where you can say, okay, well, I've done all the check boxes, so I've covered everything.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of disabilities that aren't blindness that people don't think of, maybe because they're not as readily physical or visible, but things like vestibular issues where, parallax can make some people seasick, or, a learning disability where maybe you need more time to read the content and an auto-advancing carousel is a real pain for you. Things like that we need to be considerate of as well.
Also, I would submit, even though it is kind of, it is covered in WCAG colorblindness, I have not met, please, someone yell at me on Twitter if I'm incorrect in saying this, but I have not met a colorblind person personally that has ever identified as being disabled. So to kind of, in some things that I don't think are presently covered in WCAG are some more inclusive design principles, and how to address people, or how not to address people. Not necessarily calling someone out as being like, hey, you're disabled, use this special link to contact us. like, I would say that's not a very accessible practice, even though it leads to a more accessible like outcome for those people. Again, going back to someone with color blindness, or even taking my father-in-law for example, he is, for all intents and purposes, deaf. He does not identify as being deaf, and gets really mad when someone asks him if he is using his hearing aid or not. But certain controls on websites or in applications may not, adhere. Like, he has problems with certain websites because there is audio running that he can kind of hear, but he doesn't know how to, control it or turn it off. He thinks someone's talking to him, and it just generally ends in frustration for everyone within earshot of him.
Yeah, there's definitely a bias, I think, a little bit in WCAG towards situations that can be controlled via technology, and I think that's interesting to me is, and it does cover it, but cognitive impairments, either situational or biological. And like that's especially, you just hit the nail on the head, where it's like, your familiarity with technology isn't, a biological disability per se, but it is, your frustration with not having the technical know-how to mute a tab. That's not their fault. Like, that's poor design. And so, like, those kinds of things are interesting to me because, again, you can hit it off at the pass if you plan for it.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that, even though we're talking about 57 million, roughly 20% of the US, and, a billion people globally identifying as being disabled, it doesn't really cover all the people out there who, like Scott, were saying that are technically could be disabled but do not identify as such. So there's so many more people out there than even what the old stats from 2010 say. Which is good to know, so we talked about situational disabilities, we talked about temporary disabilities, we talked about, extreme disabilities, but there's the whole gamut. And I think that's great. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. So it's good to remember that not everyone fits into that nice little mold of, disabled, which is a bad term as it is. But if you have any more thoughts on that, we can circle back, but we can move on to a question from Wes Rublakava. He's the coworker of Helena, and I believe the other half of the Accessibots. I may have blown his cover there, but he asks, how accessible to hamburger navigation tend to be? Do we have any libraries or examples that you like? So we're talking probably mostly about mobile, but probably there's other instances of that as well. What do you guys think?
So I do have an example available. I wrote it a long time ago. It's on A11yproject.com/patterns. It's basically an example of a accessible mobile menu where it just pops down from the top, I think it was. But more generally speaking to that, I think in navigation and headers in general seem to be just such a wild west of anything goes, right? There's no really standard per se, other than like the hamburger menu, which always makes me hungry. So it's just the idea of like, this is such a critical piece of any website. You have your logo and your navigation, and I've seen some pretty wacky like instances out there where stuff just doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. And I don't know, it's just a strange phenomenon. I've been thinking about like everything else on a website seems fairly standard, your standard layouts, you have your footer, and you have a modal window, you have like a date picker, what have you. But the header, so critical yet so out there all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess as far as examples go, there's this one I mentioned. I don't know if anyone else has any good examples you've seen.
Well, I know that Scott O'Hara designed one or developed one that I used for the accessibility style guide, but there's other that's more of a perfect example, example, not a real world example. I don't know if you guys have any real world examples, maybe clients or something.
Did I do that? I actually forgot.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's one of your reposts. So if you guys don't know Scott O'Hare too much, if you go to GitHub, I mean, we all kind of have a presence there, but Scott's got, I think, maybe the most. Scott O, probably followed by Scott V, but a lot of accessibility patterns and different JavaScript-y fun things that are out there from you to
I was actually
learn.
just playing with his ARIA switch pattern yesterday. Thank you, Scott. That was handy.
Good.
Scott,
Yeah, okay. Now we stopped the conversation because he's very modest, but you guys are all, experts in your own right, so thanks.
I don't know if I'm modest just as much as I don't know what to do in situations like this. Like, do I get all narcissistic and agree with you, or do I just kind of like run away? Like, I want to run away right now.
Take it. You did the work. Take it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You said, do you ever just black out, Scott, and wake up having wrote a complete, component library?
Yes.
Nice.
Back to the question at hand, because I don't like where this is going. As far as my experience with hamburger menus specifically, I think that they can be perfectly fine as long as they're just appropriately coded and they're not doing, wacky things like you're about to understand my term of wacky is really boring, but wacky things like, using an icon only to, like the little free thing icon to indicate that it's a menu, like put a label in there, damn it. Don't do things like use like the checkbox hack in CSS, and because while that can be really clever use of CSS, and I have committed that sin in the past, it's not an expected behavior to hit a checkbox and then have an entire navigation, become available to someone. So
yeah, I've experienced that too in the wild checkbox.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To answer the question, do we want to sort of describe how it should be coded, or?
Sure, and then any links that you guys talk about today, we'll try to grab and post otherwise, so don't worry about that part as much, but yeah.
So I was going to say have the actual control as a button element, native button, as well as add on the area expanded attribute, just so that you have that context there if this thing opens and closes a menu. As far as mobile menus, you probably want to have something, it depends on your design, but you want to have it slide off screen, or you want to have it come from the top. It doesn't really matter as long as the DOM order makes sense. So you would want to have the button and then the actual list of links below that in the DOM. And then something else to take in mind is when the mobile menu is off the screen, you want to make sure to have that set to display none, just so when screen readers are coming through and they're tabbing through the content, they can't actually get to that off-screen content, right? Because it's not visible. So basically on click, you want to toggle that area expanded to true. You want to toggle, obviously, the focus. You want to toggle the visibility of the content, but focus state, I don't know, Scott, do you have any comments on the focus? I know you do.
I'm laughing, yes.
It's of my opinion that the focus state should not be managed. It should remain on the button because it will announce to users the updated state change, and then they can, determine whether or not they want to move. It happens that sometimes cats jump on keyboards and stuff opens, and you're just like, oh no, I didn't want that to happen. And if focus is managed, then you're like, oh wait, why am I here?
Yeah. I will say this too, if for whatever reason the business logic case is made, if you do manage focus, you'd want to use an anchor, just because that's the semantic meaning of the anchor is, to click this thing, focus is going to be moved somewhere else on the page. So, but if you're using the button, don't manage focus.
But while we're talking about focus, remembering that not everyone who is navigating via focus, like a keyboard, is blind. So please theme your focus states. Just after hover, add focus, so that people tabbing with the keyboard that can see can enjoy those states as well and see where they are on the page. And don't take the fuzzy blue box off unless you theme it to something else.
Completely and totally agree with that. Don't look at that as being an ugly thing that you have to get rid of, or focus it a fun design challenge. Make a nice looking focus state.
Yeah.
Creative.
But not one that relies solely on color.
Right.
So, I mean, here's a controversial statement. Most browsers don't do a good enough job out of the box with a focus state that's apparent. I'm looking at you, Firefox. Those little gray margin ants are fairly visible.
Is that controversial? I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay. It's
Calm down, Eric. That's so controversial.
The other thing just is whether or not you need a hamburger at all. I have definitely seen a hamburger. I've seen a hamburger inside of a hamburger, and like if you're in that situation, you have problems. But I've seen a hamburger pop open to expand only 2 navigation items, and at that point, I'm willing to understand that you may kind of just be going to like a UI library and being like, oh, okay, that's what they tell you to do for a navigation thing. But you might as well, if there's only 2, you might as well just expose it and have it be apparent and save yourself a whole lot of coding and a whole lot of, cognitive overhead. The other thing is when the hamburger does transition, this is one of those times where people love to put some delight into the design, and I've seen that be a vestibular trigger. So if you are coding these things up, honor the reduced motion media query. I think was it yesterday that it's like slated to be in all the other browsers aside from Safari?
Really?
Yeah.
I saw, if not yesterday, very recently. Yeah, I saw that.
Is this an example when Safari got it right and not wrong?
Mm-hmm.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, kind of segueing into the next question is just, sorry, I'm going to skip that one again about WCAG 2.1, but what are your top 3 favorite accessibility tools? Like if you are testing that sort of thing, like we were just talking about the hamburger menu and the focus states and all that, like what would you use personally?
Wave tool.
Scott is showing his keyboard, yeah.
Yes, I'm showing my keyboard.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a go-to except just manually testing everything. I was searching for a tool. It's not really important, but I was searching for a tool to do screenshot annotations, and it turns out that in Mac, the default preview app actually has a whole whack of tools available. So you can add text, you can add boxes and arrows and stuff. So I thought that was pretty neat. But and also Giphy capture for Mac, so you can create little like videos, so to speak, of actions of what the issue might be.
So those are the only tools you guys use? Everything else is magic?
Kind of. Well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, on the broader spectrum of things, another, I guess it might be considered a tool, I don't know, but Zoom itself has pretty good accessibility as far as what I'm told. And we used to do a lot of remote usability sessions with folks in their own homes using Zoom. So that's also a pretty cool tool to have in your toolbox, just to be able to do those remote sessions with people.
Yeah, I mean, I use a gamut of tools, like color contrast checkers.
Top three.
Yeah, but okay.
You're gonna break all the rules. No, yeah. I'm sorry. We can get more links later, but I'm just trying to get to the point where, like, are we actually using these tools? Are these all internal checklists? Are these, like, how does this accessibility happen for you? You're finding all these things, but I know some of that is experience and just kind of knowing after a while, but just trying to get other people who are getting into it, like, what would they use? What would they do to get some of that experience and knowledge?
I'd also say not necessarily a tool, but also the website for the area best practices, guidelines, whatever that is, that website sort of outlines like the expectations of this widget should behave like this, it should have these attributes, and there's usually a pretty good example for each one. So that's a really great tool to, if you're taking an existing template or an existing widget and you're trying to make that accessible, this site says this is how it should work and this is how it should behave. So that's also technically a tool, I guess. I don't know, but it's a really good resource.
Yeah, I would consider that a tool. A lot of the stuff is very much in draft status still, but I have high hopes for it when it's completed.
The Axe browser extension is lovely and wonderful, and it's a workhorse. Yes. What I enjoy about it is like you can click and pop right into a detailed description of what's going on. The other thing there, though, is again, you know, Helena, you totally nailed it with education and prep. Like, you don't want to be in the business of doing spot welding to fix this stuff. If you see repeated patterns, you want to investigate why it's happening and why it's systemic. And, you know, the tool is really good at showing you, like, at this point, this thing is happening, but you always kind of want to be cognizant that it might be, you know, there might be something upstream that's causing it. But it's also great for like a little robot that reminds and remembers all the things that it might not occur to you in the heat of the moment. And I think that's really valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if you're working with designers, like kind of like you were saying, Eric, if you start at the beginning instead of spot welding, look at the comps before you start. So I like showing designers their work in Color Oracle because it shows what the comps look like with different types of color blindness, and using Contrast A from DOS Plankton, which is a text contrast tool to see if it's passing. And the cool one about that is it doesn't just test the text as it is, it also tests the contrast level at different types of color blindness. Because if you're red-green colorblind, those colors might have a different contrast ratio for you than for someone who's seeing all of the colors differently. So there's that. But Wave Tool is a great tool if you're just starting out with accessibility and you want to kind of get a sense of the low-hanging fruit. Not as good as a person. No automated tool ever will be. But it's a really great one because it explains not just what's wrong, but why it's wrong and how to fix it. So it's a good resource for learning.
That's a good point. And then the idea that all of these tools that we're talking about, they're testing specific pieces, but if you're doing a full audit of a site, that none of these automatic tools really will be 100%. It's a combination of these automated tools plus manual testing plus assistive device testing and that sort of thing. And I know I'm going to get back to your other question, but I'm going to ask here, TBK Creative is asking about, is anyone automating any portion of their testing? So along those lines, like, do you guys have a workflow maybe when you're doing an audit of using, you know, I use this tool like the Wave tool first, now I'm going to use Contrast Checker, now I'm going to use keyboard testing, and so on. Do you guys have that in place at your organizations? Without sharing secrets, trade secrets.
I can't speak for everyone in my organization, but I like to use things like Axe. That's kind of answering the previous question, which I was going to answer, but then you talked over me, Carrie. I use things like Axe or, you know, WebAIM Color Contraster to basically check myself to make sure I haven't missed anything in my manual audits. Because again, back on the topic of automated testing, like I could have a page full of divs with the appropriate ARIA rules on them, but no JavaScript behind them to actually make anything function the way it's supposed to function. And the automated testing tool is going to be like, this is all correct. And then I'm going to try to use it and I'm going to be like, lied. But it's not on the tool can't know that in all instances.
And it doesn't have human reasoning. So, you know, if you've got alt attributes that are just black hat SEO, keyword stuffing nonsense, there's an alt attribute there. It's just not a good one.
Right.
Yeah.
Or even in cases where, you know, an empty alt value, like that's completely appropriate for decorative images, but you might have an empty alt value on an image that does convey information. And, you know, it won't pick that up. I mean, it might throw a warning saying like, hey, is this supposed to be empty? And that's good, but it won't necessarily be like error wrong.
Yeah. I'm gonna argue in favor of the robots for a second. So we consult, so there is no one canonical treatment that we do. But I'm a really big proponent of installing accessibility checks into a CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment situation. And it's because, again, it's minding things that may not occur to you to mind. You can write custom rules for unique content types or situations, but I'm not going to be there. Like, the contract's going to end and I will go away, and I'm not going to be that voice that's going to be like, hey, did you use semantic markup? Hey, did you do this? Hey, did you do that? And I think you want to supplement that with education, so it's not just another kind of thing that just yells at you and you have to, fight your way through it. But like, ideally it's there to just catch anything that slips through. And the reason I like it on CI/CD is because, pessimistically, if you install it locally on developers' machines, what we've encountered is a lot of the times they'll circumvent it in order to get the code pushed up. So, I mean,
boo.
Yeah.
I've literally seen an alt tag that has the text in it added to stop error.
You always have some really great examples, Scott. And by great, I mean like the world's worst.
It's, again, though, it's regardless of how I may come across in my deadpan monotone voice, like, it is about education, and people don't necessarily know that what they're doing is not good. They may just look at it as like, oh, this is an error, but why is this an error? Like, oh, I found a way to fix the error. And it all comes back, circling back to like making sure that they have a empathy and a solid understanding of why things need to be done a certain way, or how certain language or experiences may alienate or make interfaces difficult for someone. Like, it's not your fault necessarily if you don't know what you're doing is wrong. It's when you do know what you're doing is wrong and then you do it anyway that then you deserve an uppercut.
That's a good point. I like that. Coming back to the tools question, I think maybe you could also consider that tool as the empathy skill, just being empathetic towards folks out there, and being aware of these concerns that could come up and do something about it, right? So, also to Eric's point, I will say for us at Shopify, I think we try to do things on the CI side. I think we're trying a few things like Axe. We're trying also PALI, so that's PA11y.org. I don't have all the details because there's other folks working on that front, but we're trying a few things and let you know how it goes. But it's a good thing to be able to have those tools available to add to that situation that Eric suggested. We're not always going to be there. Well, in my case, I will be, but not everyone will be there. So having tools like that would be really great. Also, I was going to say, quickly coming back to the tools, like React has its accessibility linter. There's a few other linters out there that are really good for editors. So watch out for those as well. That's always a good thing to have in your tool chest.
Yeah, and I'm a big. Oh, go ahead.
One more quickie tool. I guess I don't know if it's a tool or a feature, but even if you're not a dev, if you use Twitter a lot, go into your user options and you can turn on alternative text for your posts. So if you like to post images, pop some alternative text on there with that. I don't know why it's not on by default. It should be, but.
No, I totally understand that. I just recently got that. There's I think it was Scott who told me about this one where you have to follow and they'll yell at you if you don't add descriptive text to your images. It's awesome. Except for every time I do it, then I feel so embarrassed. Like, I feel doubly bad that I forgot. So apologies to everybody. But back to the tool discussion, as far as like one thing about PALI that maybe Scott V didn't point out, but that I think is important, is that with all these tools, like doing that regression testing, sprint regression testing, or feature regression testing is like really critical. So if you have a dev site and a live site or a test site or whatever, then you can compare and contrast using all these tools we talked about and see, hey, did I introduce new bugs? Like, not only are you fixing the bugs that already existed, don't introduce new bugs. Like, It's already hard enough.
Yeah. Scott also mentioned one of my other favorite tools, which is an uppercut.
I don't actually advocate the use of uppercuts. Those should be held for very specific situations where you're playing 8-bit Nintendo Mike Tyson's Punch-Out.
Yeah.
No, we do not advocate violence
No.
unless we're talking GoBots, and then I think it's allowed.
Oh, shut up.
All right, so we talked about tools a little bit. Can we circle back to the question we had earlier about 2.1 guidelines? And I know that they're pretty new, technically not live yet, although still being worked on. I don't think they're live unless something changed and I missed the memo, but how are they different from the 2.0 guidelines in the sense of, I know, Scott, you pointed out a little bit about how they're a little bit more updated for today's devices and whatnot, but how, A, are you integrating those things? Are any of you guys integrating those things into your current sites now? Are you still working on 2.0s, and is that difficult enough? And what is the difference really between those 2.0s and 2.1s? And you have like 1 minute to answer that question.
Yes, so I am integrating 2.1 into a few things, my own personal projects, as well as a few things at Shopify. I feel like, it's quite, 2.1 is still really new, like we know, but it's getting there, and I think it's worthwhile to potentially already just start integrating these things in, because eventually, the support will be there for these for the spec. So yeah, I'm definitely using some of it, not all of it, but some. I do my own assessment. I typically assess against 2.0, but I also find things that aren't in the WCAG spec that would make things a little more comfortable for users. So that's something else to consider. Just like, you can make your site compliant all you want, but it doesn't necessarily equal a accessible and usable experience per se. So you gotta do those tests.
Mm-hmm.
Is anyone else using 2.1 right now? Or are you still focused on 2.0? It's okay if you are. It's not a bad question. I mean, they're still not quite out there yet, but I'm thinking about it.
I'm personally not recommending, or it's not that I'm not recommending 2.1 standards as much as I try to allude to them in a roundabout way. Typically, a lot of a lot of people that I've worked for, a lot of organizations I've worked for, they really want to see like AA compliance, because that's kind of the de facto standard. But I often try to submit best practices that one could follow, which some of the 2.1 guidelines fall under, or I try to point to AAA standards that they might want to implement, because sometimes the AAA stuff is actually easier to implement than the single A stuff. It's not like it progressively gets harder, it just progressively gets better.
I think you mentioned that, Scott, maybe doing a talk about or actually, I think it was actually Andrew McPherson, who's not with us today, but he was talking about how AAA, everyone's afraid of it, but it's like some of those things aren't that more difficult than the AA requirement, or the single A even. So to not be afraid of it. And so that's what you're saying too, like you can go above and beyond what the normal regulations are.
Right. I mean, yeah, hitting those standards only just makes things better. Mm-hmm. So I don't know why you wouldn't want to be better, but I don't know a lot of things. So,
Eric or Helena, do you guys have any questions or thoughts on that?
I have a funny anecdote.
Sure.
This client came to us recently, and they said, well, we're getting complaints about our accessibility. And, we had it looked at, but we got an A, so I don't know what's wrong. I thought that was very funny.
Good start.
That is very funny. So for any newbies that are here today, the WCAG 2.0 guidelines have the A, which is the easiest, all the way to AAA, which is more difficult. But that's what she's saying. So we've got an A. So maybe that is the least amount. We kind of target, I think most people I've talked to target like a AA, so something in between the two. So the question that TBK Creative is knocking it out of the park today with all these great questions, but along those lines, what do you think that web accessibility will look like in 5 years with the adoption of the 2.1s and all the other changes with technology? What do you envision? Good and bad.
For me, what I'm kind of excited about is really, 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 really good computer vision, and then smart people hooking that up to assistive technology. I think it's going to be really cool for interoperability. You know, Siri and Alexa are voice UIs that are just basically screen readers with a little bit more brain behind it. And this is kind of a scary thing because I think it kind of threatens some people's way of conducting business, unfortunately. But if I have machine vision that's looking at a web page and telling me what I'm seeing, it potentially can obviate the need for like ARIA over engineering, depending on how that's built. You know, that's kind of pie in the sky, and obviously the devil's in the details, but like we're getting really, 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 really good at describing, you know, simple 2D shapes, which is what interfaces are. Describing photos is a lot more difficult, but you're already starting to see kind of hints of that. Facebook will auto tag its images with machine learning. It's not ideal and it's not great, and you're never going to get the nuance that like a handwritten alt tag will do, but I think it's a little preview of kind of what's to come.
The Internet of Things too is going to make such a big difference for people. I mean, our whole house is rigged up because we're lazy, but if you're disabled, I mean, I can turn the fan off right now with my voice. I can adjust my thermostat from the couch. You know, everything is just, hey, Google, do my thing. And my house just runs itself now. So, you know, that's really liberating for people with disabilities that are mobile to not have to get up and do these things.
You guys reminded me, Eric, of the puppies versus muffins debate about the auto tagging. So it's talking about is this a muffin or is this a puppy? So yeah, I mean, there's some really cool advances, and I love that Helena and her husband have this like auto house that space age and whatnot. But I kind of also wonder the world of VR. I know that's kind of been a hot topic lately, and how that maybe will help in the world of accessibility.
It's going to hurt the world of accessibility next month when Fallout 4 VR comes out, because I'm out for a while.
Have fun.
We'll see you next month. No.
Well, as far as VR is concerned, Eric Bailey and myself, we were at A11yTO camp a few weeks ago, I guess. There's a speaker there who was a YouTuber and a gamer. He plays games and he does tons of stuff, but he was blind, but he had the opportunity to try out to VR for the first time playing the Star Wars game. And he was just beyond excited. Like, I guess, what did he say, Eric? Like, this is the first time he's ever actually like really see and play a video game because the screen was so close to his face that he was actually able to see and experience this thing.
Yeah.
So there's that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I felt a lot of feelings.
Yeah, that was a pretty amazing talk. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I'm pretty optimistic for the next 5 years. We've seen an explosion of tools, you know, just addressing all these interesting things. And like, you know, sometimes people are cynical and they're saying, oh, it's just a vanity metric, but like the more effort and attention that is put on accessibility, the better. And like, it really does kind of feel like we're in this kind of the beginning of something a lot bigger and a lot more easy to do and a lot more kind of robust with a lot more option and choice. So hopefully in 5 years, it'll be overwhelmed with choice of tools.
I hope for augmented reality with that.
All right, well, we're at the 5-minute mark, so we can wrap up. Any closing thoughts for people? Is there one takeaway you want everyone who maybe is new, especially to accessibility, to take away from this kind of discussion?
Just do your best. You know, just care and do your best, and you know, anything else can be worked out.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say talk to people. I would say go to a local meetup. If there's anyone doing accessibility talk, definitely hit them up. And there's tons of material out there to read, but if you learn by doing, you learn by example. Again, A11ypatterns.com/patterns. Did I say that right? I don't even know. We'll link it later. Anyway, there's lots of examples out there that are really good. And I'd say check those out.
I'd say I think your attitude goes a long way toward it. You know, if you kind of sigh and think of it as like an obligation or a checkbox, that's not going to get you far, you know. Think and talk about it like the exciting challenge that it is to positively impact your users, and I think it'll go far.
Don't be afraid to get your feet wet. There's always more work to be done, but you got to start somewhere.
That's amazing. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Eric, Helena, Scott, and Scott for the excellent discussion today. I know, again, that each question we talked about could potentially have a whole talk of its own. So we hope that some of you guys come back and want to elaborate on any specific question, like 2.1 or whatnot, or any of the other amazing accessibility opportunities that are out there. Come back and give a talk. And then a reminder that Accessibility Talks happens every month. We're going to be coming back to you in December 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And we are going to be joined by a mystery guest just in time for the holidays. So that person, it's not Scott, it's not Scott, but that person will be talking about accessibility priorities and demoing some of the cool new things. So I hope you can join us then. Until then, talk to you later. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.